Hey, well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our AJA Zoom events, both to our regulars and to any new people that may be joining us this week. Welcome to those also watching on Facebook. And we also have people listening to the audio replay, which is broadcast every Thursday at midday and Sundays at 4 p.m. on J-Air Jewish Community Radio, FM 88 in Melbourne, or j-air.com.au everywhere else. My name is Alan Friedman, Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, the President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, Lyn Julius, who we will introduce formally in a moment. This week, we're going to feature a presentation from Lyn, after which we will open up for questions from the audience. Just a reminder to any of our Zoom participants, the way to get our attention is to raise your hand electronically. And the way you do that is to click the reactions button at the bottom, or the participants, and you'll see a little hand icon. And if you click that, we get to see it, and then we put you in the line for asking questions. Now, if you want to ask a written question, this can be placed on the chat function, and Robert Gregory, our Director of Public Affairs, will read out some of these in between the spoken ones. Now, we never stop hearing the big lie about the so-called Nakba, and how around the time of Israel's creation, Jewish colonisers barged into a supposed ancient Palestinian state, threw the inhabitants out of their houses and stole their land. Well, what we know did happen, and which doesn't get anywhere near the media attention it deserves, is that with the rise of Arab nationalism and the conflict in Mandatory Palestine around this time, Arab states confiscated the property of their native Jews living in the Middle East and North Africa. They also cancelled their citizenship, expelled, arrested and even tortured and murdered many of them. Lyn Julius is a journalist and author and the co-founder of an organisation called Harif, the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. She spent 10 years researching the subject, which resulted in her book that you can see behind me, titled Uprooted: How 3,000 Years of Jewish Civilization in the Arab World Vanished Overnight. To tell us more about this, we're delighted to have her with us tonight. Lyn, welcome to the AJA and to Australia, and thanks for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Alan, and thank you to the AJA for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be with you. Greetings from Israel, where we're awaiting our third grandchild, who is in no hurry to come out, I think.
Okay, now you've got a presentation,
yes.
so you can do screen sharing whenever you're ready. And
do that now, yeah. Okay. Okay, so the subject of this talk is obviously the 850,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries who were ethnically cleansed, I think is the right expression, in the last 70 years or so, and who hardly get any media attention. And yet their issue, I feel, is the key to understanding the Middle East conflict. And it is the answer to almost every myth peddled about Israel and the Jewish people. I've written this book, Uprooted, as Alan mentioned. It grew out of a blog, actually, which you can access. It's called Point of No Return. Just Google Point of No Return blog and you get to it, and it's updated every day. And after about 10 years of blogging, I learned a great deal about this subject. I collated information from the web, from various sources. So certain themes began to emerge, and I thought I would put the highlights in this book. There isn't very much available on the subject of Jewish refugees. Martin Gilbert wrote a book called In Ishmael's House, which is absolutely excellent and was the first really accessible mainstream source on the subject. I'll tell you a little bit about my own background. My parents were Jews from Iraq. They left in 1950 and they came to live in the UK. They were part of a very small minority of Jews who did not go to Israel. 90% of the community, which numbered about 150,000, went to Israel, where they are now the third largest community after the Russian and the Moroccan. So a very important part of the Israeli Jewish population. Why did I write this book? Well, there is total ignorance, I think. Here in the diaspora, which is Ashkenazi dominated, there is very little education about the Sephardim and Mizrahim. And in fact, Sephardim and Mizrahim don't know their own history and have not really passed on their history to their children because they've been so busy trying to resettle in their new countries. Although there is now a trend to sort of rediscover your roots, certainly amongst the younger generation. So although I was born in the UK, I grew up with this story of the Iraqi Jews because I still had relatives living in Iraq in the 1960s. In fact, I had one aunt who had resettled in London with her children. She was a widow. She decided to go back to Iraq to sell some property in 1964, I think it was, thinking it would take her just a few weeks or a month and she could then rejoin her children in England. As it turned out, she was trapped for 6 years in Iraq, leaving her children in the care of my parents. Eventually, she managed to get out illegally. She was smuggled out of Iraq in 1970, 71, along with about 2,000 of the remaining Jews who were absolutely desperate to leave but couldn't. They couldn't get passports, and they were suffering a sort of reign of terror in Iraq. Iraq had hanged 9 Jews in Liberation Square on trumped up spying charges for Israel. That happened in 1969. And that was just the beginning because about 40 Jews were arrested, jailed, and were never seen again. And to this day, we do not know what happened to them. So that's the sort of background. And I will now move on to the next slide. So 850,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries. This is a larger number than Palestinian Arabs who fled Israel, and it's the largest number of non-Muslim refugees up until 2003, when there was a mass exodus of Christians from Iraq. Why are they important? Well, first of all, because theirs is a neglected issue, a human rights issue. They deserve justice. Their issue should be on the peace agenda. In fact, it will help achieve peace and reconciliation because people will realize that 2 sets of refugees, not one, emerged out of the Arab-Israeli conflict in a sort of de facto exchange of populations. And this will help achieve a sort of reconciliation between the parties. It's also important because over 50% of the Jews of Israel do hail from Arab or Muslim countries. They're the refugees or their descendants. And therefore they are in Israel, not because of the Nazis, but because of the Arabs. This gives you an idea of the countries which I deal with in my book. You have Morocco on the very extreme left of the map, and Yemen in the far east or southeast on the edge of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. There are 10 countries in all. I use the Fardim and Mizrahim sort of interchangeably. The term Mizrahi is quite a recent term, meaning Easterners, but it is a little absurd when applied to Moroccan Jews who really come from a country to the west of most of Europe. Sephardi really describes their kind of religious practice more than anything else. But literally it means from Spain, and some of these communities are mixed, Sephardi from Spain and Mizrahi, which have been in those countries for thousands of years, as I shall explain. The decline in the Jewish population in Arab countries was absolutely dramatic. I'm not making comparisons with the Holocaust and the genocide that occurred in Europe, but the decline in the Jewish population in Arab states was actually more dramatic than the decline in the Jewish population of Europe, without the tragic consequences resulting from World War II. Most Jews did get out alive from Arab countries, although hundreds did die in violent episodes, and there were executions and torture, etc. So the history of the Jews in Arab countries goes back thousands of years, certainly predates the Arab conquest. The Jews settled in the Middle East and North Africa 1,000 years before Islam. And in fact, they go back to biblical times. The area really has almost as much Jewish history as the land of Israel itself. And there are 17 biblical figures who lived and died in the region, and 5 biblical prophets. And Ezekiel was one of those prophets, and he's buried in a shrine south of Baghdad in Iraq. And here you see a picture showing scribes writing down blessings and prayers for the visiting pilgrims at the shrine of Ezekiel. This photo was taken in the 1930s, and about 5,000 Jews would visit at the time of Shavuot, and again between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. On the right-hand side, you see a detail of the Hebrew inscriptions that surround the burial chamber of the tomb of Ezekiel. But look at the state of the shrine today. It's been transformed beyond recognition. In fact, it is now a giant Shiite mosque. And the original tomb of Ezekiel, I think the inscriptions are still there, but it has been completely, its Jewish character has been completely altered. And if a Jew were to turn up and say he wanted to visit the tomb of Ezekiel, he wouldn't be allowed in. And this is really what's happened to Jewish heritage all over the Middle East and North Africa. Synagogues have been transformed into mosques or sports clubs or shops, or they've been allowed to crumble to dust. Jewish cemeteries have had roads constructed across them, or they've been vandalized and fallen into neglect. And there is very little actually left of this millennial Jewish presence, with one notable exception, and that is in Morocco, where the king has actually invested a great deal in preserving and restoring Jewish sites, cemeteries, and Jewish quarters. But cynics would say, well, tourism is the second largest currency earner in Morocco, and you know, this is all for the benefit of the tourists. And in fact, these buildings will be empty. They will never really come to life because the Jewish community in Morocco is now 1% of its former size. So what was the relationship between Jews and Muslims during the 14 centuries that they lived side by side? There was a great deal of symbiosis, cultural symbiosis. You know, Islam was influenced by Judaism, and the languages are very similar, and some of the customs. But the Jews were never considered equal to the Muslims. In fact, they had a special status called the dhimmi status. Jews and Christians were allowed to practice their religion, but they had to be reminded that they had failed to convert to the ultimate religion of Islam. They had to pay a special tax called the jizya tax to the ruler of the day, who in return would protect them. And that meant the Jews were defenseless. They had to subcontract their right to self-defense to the ruler of the day. The ruler of the day could be very good, or he could be terrible. The dhimmi could never really predict what the situation would be, and they really had very few rights. They had no legal rights. They were humiliated. They had to wear special clothing, and there's a whole host of restrictions on their lives. And I will now read you a short passage from my book to illustrate the dhimmi status. In a similar way to their Ashkenazi counterparts in medieval Europe, Jews in Morocco were debarred from certain occupations by the Islamic guilds. As in Europe, they performed certain necessary economic functions like money lending and associated tasks like metalworking, which were deemed reprehensible or unlucky by the non-Jewish majority. The Jews were given the most menial of tasks. One such job assigned to them was the salting of the decapitated heads of executed captives. In Yemen, the job of cleaning the sewers was done by a subcaste of Jews. In Egypt today, the Christian Copts are the rubbish collectors. In 20th century Iraq, Christians also did menial jobs in conformity with their lowly status, like cleaning septic tanks. The small Sephardi community of Palestine was so abased under Muslim rule that a contingent of Ashkenazi followers of the false messiah Shabbatai Tzvi, seeking refuge in Jerusalem in 1700, refused to put up with the humiliations suffered by the Sephardim. The Arabs behave as proper thugs towards the Jews, one wrote. In Palestine, Jews were not allowed to worship freely at their holy places. The Mamluk rulers forbade them from treading beyond the seventh step on the staircase to the burial place of the patriarchs in Hebron. Nothing equals the misery and suffering of the Jews of Jerusalem, wrote Karl Marx. Turks, Arabs, and Moors are the masters in every respect. To be a dhimmi was to be continually reminded of Islam's supremacy over Judaism and Christianity. Of course, Jews performed an essential function as commercial go-betweens and could and did rise to lofty positions as courtiers, sarafs, that's treasurers, and merchants. Some were fabulously rich, like Haim Fahi. But like him, these Jews could just as quickly fall into disfavor. Fahi had his nose cut off and his eye gouged out by a treacherous Ottoman governor and was subsequently assassinated. So as you can see, the dhimmi status really was very precarious and insecure. All this changed quite dramatically in the 19th century as the Western powers increased their influence in the Middle East and North Africa. By 1856, the dhimmi rules had been abrogated in the Ottoman Empire, but they continued to be in force in places that were not under Ottoman control. For instance, in Morocco, where the dhimmi status was not abrogated until 1912 and the advent of the French protectorate. The dhimmi status continued in Persia, in Iran, until 1925, and it continued more or less up until 1950 in Yemen. But the European powers insisted on equality for the Jews and Christians with the Muslims, and this created a real revolution, a social revolution. Instead of being inferior, the Jews began to be educated, middle class began to emerge, and when the European powers set up their protectorates and their mandates, the Jews were in a very good position to really help run the country. Now, alongside the increase in the influence of the colonial powers, a group of well-meaning French Jews who were enjoying the fruits of emancipation in Europe decided to set up a network of schools called the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And by 1900, there were over 200 schools, mainly in the Muslim world. And this had a revolutionary effect, because up until then, Jews were only given a religious education, and only the boys were educated, not the girls. But the Alliance began education for girls. They taught Jews languages, English, French, Turkish, Arabic, and Hebrew, and of course prepared these Jews for the modern world, giving them all the skills to thrive and also to defend themselves and their rights. So before long, the Jews were running the civil service in Iraq, for instance, transport and banking and trade, and they were dominating the stock exchange, and in Egypt there were great entrepreneurs. They even built cities or suburbs of cities in Egypt. They built the railway lines. They started all the main banks. There were two finance ministers, one in Iraq and one in Egypt, who were Jews in the 1920s. Now, the effect of all this was to create a sort of chasm between the Jews and the Muslims, because the Jews, instead of behaving as inferiors, were really behaving as superior. They were really acting beyond their station. And this, I do believe, is an important factor in explaining the conflict we have today between Israel and certain Arab countries. There is quite a deep cultural resentment of the Jews for not acting as dhimmis anymore. The Jews also excelled in the arts during the colonial era. In Iraq, most of the musicians were Jews, not because the Muslims were any worse at playing music, but because an imam had issued a ban on Muslims learning or performing, and so the Jews stepped into the breach. In Egypt, which was the Hollywood of the Arab world, Jewish actresses played important roles. Bottom left, you have Layla Murad, who's the great diva in Egypt, and her songs are still heard and played all over the Arab world, but of course people don't know she was Jewish. Lillian Levy-Cohen, stage name Camellia, figures on the front of my book. She was very prolific. She made about 30 films in the space of, 18 films in the space of 3 years, but tragically died in a plane crash when she was only about 30. And rumor had it that she was King Farouk's mistress, and he had her killed off because she was no longer, convenient to have around. So the colonial era actually was quite brief. It only lasted from the end of the 19th century to about 1940. And this is the era that most Jews remember with great nostalgia. But it came to an end. And how did it come to an end? It came to an end with the rise of anti-Semitism. There were several types of anti-Semitism. One form was colonial anti-Semitism. And here you see a pamphlet produced by Edouard Drumont, who led the campaign against Captain Dreyfus, who was, as you know, wrongly accused of betraying France. He was the member of parliament for Algiers, and Algeria was then considered part of metropolitan France, and the Jews had actually been given French nationality. But there was a large population of white settlers in Algeria, and they were extremely anti-Semitic. They resented the Jews for having French nationality. And they even incited riots against them. And the Jews were really caught between two stools, colonial resentment and also Muslim resentment, because these Jews who had French nationality were no longer dhimmis, whereas the Muslims did not have that privilege. So the colonial powers were very happy to exploit the Jews for their skills, their talents, their languages, but they weren't, except in Algeria, were not ready to give Jews full rights. And at times of trouble, they were not always ready to protect them. And gradually, from protecting minorities and insisting on minority rights, the European powers began to appease the Muslim majority and to divide and rule between minorities and the Muslim majority. Sorry about this, a drill has just started up in the background. This is Israel, always building. The ultimate betrayal by the colonial powers was, of course, what happened in World War II with the rise of Nazism. We had pro-Nazi governments established in North Africa, the Vichy regime, and they began to implement the first stages of the final solution. Thankfully, stripping Jews of their rights and beginning to strip them of their property. But thankfully, the Allies did win at the Battle of El Alamein, and they reversed the tide of war. But the ultimate betrayal really was what happened in Iraq. In 1941, there was a massacre called the Farhud. About 179 Jews died in Iraq at that time during 2 days of rioting in June 1941. The British Army were actually at the gates of Baghdad and could have intervened to stop the massacre, but they didn't, because they didn't want to appear to be intervening in the internal affairs of Iraq. There was another form of anti-Semitism that arose at this time, and that was the anti-Semitism associated with Arab nationalism. And Arab nationalist parties seeking independence began to emerge in the 1930s. And this is one of them, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. Their emblem might remind you of another. And these parties were actually inspired by Nazism. They were blood and soil parties that actually wanted to exclude Jews and eventually other minorities from the new independent states that would emerge in the post-colonial era. And so minorities were marginalized and eventually ushered towards the exit. There was another form of anti-Semitism that arose in the 1930s, and that was the anti-Semitism of Islamism. Now, we hear a lot about Islamism today, the Muslim Brotherhood, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, this sort of thing. But in fact, these movements have their roots in the 1930s, and they were also influenced by Nazism. Hassan al-Banna, the gentleman in the fez on the left, founded the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. And what they wanted to do was restore the caliphate. They wanted to revive Islamic rule. They wanted the Jews and the Christians to revert to their dhimmi status, and they wanted to reverse modernity. And for them, the Jews were really at the center of what they hated most, because the Jews represented modernity. They were the innovators, they were the traders, they were bringing in newfangled things from Europe. And also they represented women's rights and minority rights. So I would say that anti-Semitism was at the very center of the Muslim Brotherhood's philosophy and would become ever more important after World War II. And the Muslim Brotherhood actually did incite riots against Jews and Christians in Egypt in the 1930s. The Germans were busy trying to foment an anti-colonial, anti-British and an anti-French rebellion amongst the Arabs, and they financed the Arab Revolt in 1936. They also financed the activities of the Muslim Brotherhood. And here you see the German ambassador to Iraq, Fritz Grobber, who actually got Mein Kampf translated into Arabic and serialized in Iraqi newspapers. The third party in this three-way alliance was Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Now, he was an anti-Semite before he was an anti-Zionist. And his activities were also financed by the Germans. From the moment that Hitler took power, he sought to ally with the Nazis. In 1939, he was exiled to Baghdad. He spent 2 years there trying to overthrow the pro-British government. Eventually, he and a group of military officers and politicians succeeded in April 1941. For 2 months, there was a pro-Nazi government in Iraq. And they declared war against Britain. Britain soon defeated the government and sent the Grand Mufti and the rest of the government into exile, but not before they had incited so much anti-Jewish hatred through radio propaganda and the threat of violence that the Farhud broke out. This was the massacre I mentioned earlier. The word means forced dispossession in Arabic. 2 days of absolute mayhem, murder, rape, looting. The Jews of Iraq, who'd been there 2,600 years, received such a shock that within 10 years, they were gone. Now, Husseini ended up in Berlin as a guest of Hitler, where he broadcast anti-Jewish propaganda. Kill the Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God, history, and religion. So he was not just there as an anti-Zionist because he wanted to regain Palestine for the Arabs, but because he wanted to kill all the Jews wherever they might be. And he would have probably achieved this had the Nazis won the war. He would have been in charge of the extermination of the Jews in his sphere of influence. There he is at his famous meeting with Hitler in 1941. He also set up Muslim SS divisions in Bosnia and Albania. And here you see the soldiers at prayer. There's a myth that the Holocaust did not have an impact on Jews, Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. That is an absolute myth. The top picture shows you Tunisian Jews being marched off to labor camps when the Nazis took direct control over Tunisia in 1942. And the bottom picture shows you Libyan Jews who survived Bergen-Belsen. In fact, nearly 900 Libyan Jews were deported to Bergen-Belsen. Most of them did survive or were exchanged with German prisoners of war. There were also dreadful camps set up in Libya. There was a particularly nasty one called Jador near Tripoli, and about 600 Jews died there of starvation and disease. There were also labor camps in Morocco, which is something that not many people know, and Jews were interned in them. Now, there is a myth that we hear today, and that is that there was no anti-Semitism in the Arab world until Israel was established. But of course, you know, the Farhud is an example of a pogrom that occurred in 1941, 7 years before Israel was established. Here's another one, the pogrom that occurred in Fez in Morocco in 1912. And this is a postcard of the aftermath. About 45 Jews died there. So it is an absolute myth that there was no anti-Semitism in the Arab world. And in fact, if you look at the plight of other minorities in the Middle East, for instance, the Yazidis or the Copts, the Assyrian Christians, they've all suffered terribly, and yet they have no Israel of their own. So this points to a dysfunction, perhaps, in Arab or Muslim society, an inability to tolerate difference. So fast forward to 1948, Israel is declared. And the Arab League, which numbered 7 Arab states, declared war on Israel in May 1948. And at the same time, they declared a second war against their own Jewish citizens, whom they called the Jewish minority of Palestine. And this consisted of anti-Jewish discriminatory legislation, stripping them of their citizenship, freezing their property, and the worst statute of all really was criminalizing Zionism. And this meant that any Jew really could be arrested, jailed, and even executed on charges of being a Zionist. But the question was, how do you define Zionism? Was having a Magen David on your prayer shawl, was that Zionism? Was being in possession of a letter from Palestine, was that Zionism? So it was a useful pretext for Arab countries to scapegoat their Jews. And at the same time, there was a ban on emigration. So these Jews were effectively hostages to the first Arab-Israeli conflict. So desperate were they, because there was also an outbreak of violence in several Arab countries. So desperate were these Jews that Israel organized rescue missions. And here you see Yemenite Jews who are being airlifted to Israel. It's a lovely story. These Jews had never seen a plane before, and yet they boarded without fear because they just read the parasha the previous week. And God said, I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So they thought God was taking them to the promised land. So this happened also in Iraq. There was an airlift. In Iraq, actually, there was a very narrow window that when the Jews were allowed to emigrate legally between 1950 and 1951, they were issued with this travel document or laissez-passer. On the left-hand side, you see a stamp which says, one way, no return. So effectively, these Jews were being expelled. They could not return to Iraq. The same thing happened in Egypt shortly afterwards. Jews were given these one-way documents, one way, no return. Oops, sorry. So alongside being expelled, the Jews abandoned a huge amount of property. It is estimated that they lost land equivalent to the size of Jordan and Lebanon put together, which really puts things in perspective when you consider the current sort of disputes in the West Bank and Jerusalem. But this is an example of a rather lovely mansion that was abandoned by a Jewish family in Egypt and is now the Swiss embassy or ambassadorial residence. And it is astonishing to believe that so many present-day embassies or ambassadorial residences were once the homes of Jews. For instance, the Russian embassy, the Pakistani embassy, the South Korean embassy, the German embassy, the Canadian embassy, the Dutch embassy, and so it goes on. And of course, these Jews were never compensated for their property. They had to leave with one suitcase and £20 in their pockets. Sorry about this. And this is a map of Tahrir Square, which is in the center of Cairo. And the list on the right-hand side shows you all the Jewish properties that surrounded the square and which are now which were sequestrated. Now, what happened to these Jews? Well, the vast majority did emigrate to Israel, 650,000 out of 850,000. Now, Israel at the time was a very poor developing country. It didn't have the resources to take in all these people. In fact, it only had 600,000 people living in it. So it sort of doubled its population virtually overnight. And so it put them in tent camps or mahabarot. And a lot of the cities you have today in Israel originated as tent camps. For instance, the city of Sderot, that was a tent camp. And some of these Jews stayed in these camps that gradually turned into cities for years, for decades. And the conditions were absolutely terrible. It was very, very hard. But eventually they were well integrated into Israeli society. And today they are represented in every field. And this is an invitation to a wedding in a tent camp. And the invitation says, please join us in hut number 10 or something. But the question is, why is this story not known? And it's not known in Israel. In fact, there was a poll done recently, which said that most Israelis learnt absolutely nothing about about Mizrahi history and heritage at school. They didn't even know that there was a day in the calendar to commemorate the exodus from Arab countries and Iran. That's the 30th of November. The Knesset has actually did designate this date in 2014 as an international day of commemoration, but 89% of Israelis had not heard of it. And this artist did this artwork, which is a school book, and he's holding up the 10 pages in the book that actually cover Mizrahi history and heritage. Hopefully things will start to change, or we hope so. And before I finish, I just want to make one last point, and that is that what we refer to as the Arab world is actually a rich tapestry of different tribes and groups and peoples, and the Jews are one of them. And some of these groups have been around for thousands of years, well before Islam, well before the Arab conquest, and they are truly indigenous to the region. And it is absolutely normal for these Jews, for Jews and other indigenous peoples to want to achieve self-determination. For instance, the Kurds have been clamoring for an independent state for over 100 years, but they haven't yet achieved that. Only the Jews have been lucky enough to achieve that. They are not colonial interlopers. They are absolutely indigenous to the region. And in fact, in such a hostile region, the only way to survive really is to have your own sovereign state and the ability to defend it. So on that note, I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Lyn. We'll just close your screen sharing.
Yeah.
That's it. Now, just before we do, we've got time, we'll have time for a couple of questions. Just before we do, I will mention that if you're listening on J-Air, this is the Australian Jewish Association Zoom event, which we have every Wednesday night. Our guest tonight is Lyn Julius, an expert on the expulsion of Jews from Arab lands. Now, if you are listening on J-Air, you won't have seen the slides, of course, but you can always look at the video recording of tonight's event. That will be sent out via Facebook, or it's on the AJA YouTube channel. I'll just quickly hand over to David to give us an update on what's happening next week, and then we'll get into a couple of questions.
Thank you very much, Alan. As usual, I want to remind everyone that if you are not yet supporting AJA when this event is over, please do so. We really do need your assistance to undertake the work on your behalf. Go to the website jewishassociation.org.au. Consider applying for membership if you're not yet a member. You can subscribe to the email list and make a donation. Now, next week, we have a member of the Knesset joining us, Simcha Rothman, who will be talking about the Jewish identity of Israel and some of the challenges in ensuring that Israel remains a Jewish state. And we have a special event coming up this Sunday online. We held a screening of the movie Lest We Forget in Sydney. It was sold out. The director-producer Hugh Kitson, who's visiting from the United Kingdom, was with us. For those that couldn't make it because of the quality of this, we've decided to do the event again online so that everyone can see it, watch your emails. You can use the same login that you did tonight. It begins 7:30 this Sunday. Thank you, Alan.
Okay, thanks. And of course, with the Sunday night event, Hugh will be with us live in Melbourne, and you'll be able to ask him some questions. I can see Anthony's got his hand up. Just before we go to Anthony, Lyn, I've just got a question of my own, or a couple of angles to it. Obviously, the Palestinian Arabs are not going to acknowledge this story of Jews from the Arab lands, but are any of the countries accepting ownership? I'm just wondering whether a country like Morocco might accept some ownership of it. And the second part to that question is the Abraham Accords having any effect on this story?
Yeah, well, an interesting phenomenon is occurring in Iraq, actually, where the Jews were probably worse treated than anywhere else, and there were executions and terrible human rights abuses. There was a conference recently which attracted 200 Arabs in Iraq, and they called for normalization with Israel. They called for an apology for the treatment of the Jews. And this was absolutely astounding, really, because Iraq is technically still at war with Israel. And what happened to these Arabs? Well, they were all arrested, or rather the leaders were arrested, and we don't know actually what's happened to them since. I think you have to be very brave to call for any kind of normalization in countries like Iraq. You know, we're still not at the stage where the governments are willing to acknowledge that they got rid of their Jews. They still believe the Jews left of their own free will, or, you know, all sorts of myths. Morocco is a slightly different situation because it was not a member of the Arab League in 1948. It was still under a French control. Also, it didn't actually join the Arab League until the 1960s. And at that point, Zionism became a crime. And therefore, there were human rights abuses. People were imprisoned on charges of Zionism, etc. But no laws were actually passed stripping Jews of their citizenship or their property. But what did happen was there was a great deal of popular anti-Semitism in Morocco. There was violence or the threat of violence. And Jews left because they were scared. And when they left, they abandoned property. And so it wasn't a sort of, it wasn't state sanctioned in Morocco. And that is the difficulty there, you know, because you can't really hold them to account. So the Abraham Accords, have they changed things? Yes, I think it's been a sea change in the relationship, obviously. But what we haven't had is any sort of, you know, we haven't actually had a discussion on this subject of Jewish refugees. And the reason is that the Gulf states, who are really the prime movers in the Abraham Accords, did not really have Jewish communities. They were not really part of the conflict with Israel. Bahrain did have a Jewish community, still does have about 20 Jews living there. But you know, they're not really the main players in this whole story of expulsion and exodus.
Sure. Anthony, I've got Anthony Moish, and we'll try and get to you, Terry. So Anthony, please unmute yourself and ask a question.
Lyn, thank you for your what you've told us. Is the fact that you've exposed rather well the problems of the rescue of Jews from the Arab lands, is that going to help us in recognising the plight and the rescue of the Black Jews of Africa and to some extent the Indian subcontinent as well?
Well, there was a rescue operation in Ethiopia, Operation Solomon, in the 1990s. And I'd say that the vast majority of those Jews were rescued. There are very few left. And certainly in the Indian subcontinent, I think you might be referring to the B'nai Israel. There's still a few thousand there. But they are not actually being oppressed. You know, they don't need rescuing. They can make aliyah if they choose to do so.
Okay, Moish, please unmute yourself.
Thank you. In terms of compensation where Jews were expelled, we've got the situation with an organization here in Israel run by Nitzana Leitner, where they go to follow the money, as it were, she calls it. Is there a possibility to mount court action in countries, for instance, like the United States, for people who can seek compensation and do it through, say, the American courts, and therefore attach assets, say, of Iraq or Egypt that's located in the United States?
It's an interesting thought, but I don't see how a court case could be brought in the US. You know, people have suggested class actions in Arab countries, like, for instance, there was a move to do one in Iraq, but you never get anywhere because, you know, first of all, you might not find any lawyers to represent you. You won't find a court willing to hear the case. And at the end of the day, even if you win the case, you know, you might get a pittance in compensation. So, you know, I don't know. I certainly don't know whether going through the American courts is, I mean, I'm not a lawyer. You need to ask Nitzana if there is a legal avenue there. You know, I've certainly not heard of this being put forward as a possibility.
She might be able to help you, Lyn, if you raise
yeah.
it. Sure
it's
will.
Not something, I mean, we had a discussion, my own organization, Harif, we had a discussion on heritage and what we should do about that. And she took part in that. And actually, she did not suggest going to law on that subject. She said diplomacy was the best form of, best course of action.
Okay, yeah. Terry, will make you the last question, so please unmute yourself.
My wife is the last question.
Oh.
She always has the last word.
Thanks, Lyn. It's Sue here. My question is, Claudia Roden, the Jewish Egyptian food writer, writes very fondly of her memories of growing up in Egypt and glosses over that childhood. Would that contribute to the misunderstanding that the world has of the treatment of Jews? in that area?
Yes, I think it certainly does. That a lot of people, you know, have nostalgic memories, but actually they're nostalgic for the colonial era. You know, very few of them actually lived through, you know, this era of independent Arab states. And these independent Arab states have proved to be a complete disaster, completely intolerant of minorities. And I know Claudia Roden left in 1956, I think. So that was barely, you know, 4 years after the king was deposed. Nasser was in charge. It was a very brutal expulsion then, you know. I don't know why she doesn't mention that. You know, I think it is a problem. It is a problem. Nostalgia is a problem. We are our own worst enemies, really.
Oh, well,
but it's a human reaction, isn't it? It's human to only think of, you know, only remember the good and suppress the bad memories, isn't it?
Yes. Look, we're going to need to finish up. Lyn Julius, I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's an important issue that doesn't get nearly as much coverage as it deserves. So thank you for taking up the fight, and all power to you. Now, you've mentioned your organisation a couple of times. Just tell us a little bit about it and what the address is. Yeah.
So we have an organisation called Harif, Harif, based in the UK. Anyone can join our mailing list. You don't have to be a Jew from the Middle East and North Africa. You only have to be interested in the subject. We've got 2,000 people on our mailing list. We do regular Zoom, what we call lockdown lectures, every fortnight, and you're all welcome to join us. If you can't watch it live, we have a video channel, and please do join our mailing list. All you have to do is go to our website, which is www.harif.org, and you could subscribe to our mailing list there, and you can see our video channel.
Okay, thank you. Thanks again, Lyn. It's been wonderful to have you, and you've presented the story with so much interest. So thank you for joining us, and good luck to all your endeavours. Just before we go, I just want to mention the shtick with Henry. Oh, there's Lyn's book. Right. David put a link up to where the book can be found. It's pretty easy. If you just Google Uprooted, it'll come up, and you'll get it from Amazon or Book Depository or wherever you like. Just before we go, the shtick with Henry Greener is a weekly TV show. It's a 30-minute show that's been around for decades, and it's now on YouTube. And last week he interviewed Robert Gregory, our Director of Public Affairs. It's a very interesting little segment, and you can go online to watch it. So I encourage you all to do that. And I've just put the address up a few moments ago, the shtick.tv. So the SHTIK. So have a look out for that. That's all we have for tonight. Join us next week with Simcha Rothman, MK, on the question of Jewish continuity in Israel. Don't forget that you can keep up to date with what the AJA is talking about on our Facebook page. Please like it and share it widely. But for now, we wish you all a very good evening and look forward to seeing you as usual next week. Bye for now.